actually makes the argument that, some of this we don't necessarily want to evade. Let's just let people work with this sort of distributed intelligence with smart tools. I'm probably not going to get into that debate. In fact, I'm sure I'm not. But I think those are some ways to think about it. So I'm going to just talk about it. I could have come up with many examples of design principles for inquiry, and I just picked up a couple that have been prominent lately, or that I've read about recently. So, like I said, this is not meant to be anywhere near mutually exhaustive. So one is Danny Edelson's Learning for Use strategy, and his focus is on that learning should take place through construction and modification of knowledge structures, that knowledge construction is a goal-directed process, and that the circumstances in which knowledge is constructed and subsequently used determine how easily people will be able to get to that knowledge in the future. It's a very cognitive approach to doing this. But he's got some actually, let's see if this works. Yes. You never know. So he's got this nice set of, here are the three pieces of his strategies that motivate, the construct, the refine knowledge. And he talks about the kinds of strategies you would use to create a demand and make the students curious, to give students experience to observe and to read about phenomena, and opportunities to apply understanding. So he's got some fairly clear ideas. It's a very cognitive model, though, so it doesn't deal a lot with the social aspect of it. Kate Belagic has written about the social infrastructure framework, which talks about the broader social context in which tools will be used. So in Kate's work, she talks about needing to consider 4 different dimensions when you're designing. So where Danny Edelson talked about some of these very cognitive ideas, Kate's work says, well, you have to take a look at what are you walking into? What are the cultural beliefs that are there? For example, the teacher's belief that children can construct concepts themselves, or that they need to be fed into them, and that's an extreme example, but understanding what you're designing for in that sense is important. The practices concern ways in which teachers and students engage in both online and offline learning activities, and those are things you need to think about up front, relating to how the tools will be used. This includes issues such as whether students work in groups or alone, or combinations of the two. Includes thinking about the roles that a teacher takes in using technology-based tools. And then finally, she talks about, she talks about the socio-technical spatial variations. And this is what I find really interesting, because it talks about what's the space going to be laid out like? What's the technology going to be laid out like? And I think right around when I read this, we had done a study of students using some of our simulations. And the first time we did it, we were in a library. And the kids had study carrels, and we could barely move our cameras around, and it was a disaster. And in the future, we took laptop carts and made a huge difference. Things like space, which seem like they're trivial. So I think considering how these are going to be used and what the space is available is really important. So I think the social infrastructure framework takes a more systemic view. Less on some of the nitty-gritty design, but more on designing a learning environment writ large. And then some of the work that I've done, and this was really conversations with Mark Guzdial, was to think about how do you scaffold learning by doing, and this notion of letting them accomplish what they need to accomplish on one hand, but that they don't just do a fun project, that they actually learn it. And Mark developed the notion of software realized scaffolding, and the two of us talked about it as black and glass box scaffolding. So there's some scaffolds that you actually want people to know exactly what you're scaffolding. You want them to know, for example, that in our Stellar system, we have a sidewalk that tells them what the process is. On the other hand, you may be working with a piece of technology that just disables particular menus, and you don't really care. It just helps get the task done. Or the wizards in Excel are a nice example of another black box. It lets you get those graphs done, and you don't really care if you can ever do it by yourself. knowledge support inquiry processes. So those are sort of a glass box way of coaching. Eliciting articulation, I think knowledge form is a nice example. I actually had to go back and redo this slide because it said Cecil on here. So I know this was an old table. A new slide, but an old table. Knowledge form in which students choose the scaffolds which they use to label their notes to help them understand the role of notes in their learning. Compared with Microsoft Word, will ask you to put in some kind of summary, and you don't have any idea why they're doing it. And it helps with searching, but it's getting you to do something, but you don't really have an idea why. It may make something easier later on. So these are just some examples of design frameworks or mini frameworks that are driven from the learning sciences. And these design frameworks need to be overlaid by considering the different roles for technology. So at least in my thinking about it, and in the Goldman, Siegel, and Maxwell paper, they've talked about 4 roles for technology. One is to provide rich context for learning. And there people can view and review situations. You can make invisible phenomena visible, and there's opportunities to observe, conjecture, test ideas. Some examples of those are videos, simulations. Another role for technology is to provide collaboration spaces. And probably people have heard me as I've talked around here during the day, the notion of having different spaces for different purposes and understanding what you want to have people do in different spaces. These provide opportunities to elicit articulation, to get students talking to each other, make their thinking visible. And some examples would be threaded discussion, chat, whiteboard, knowledge forum as another one. Another role for technology is to provide access to and structure information. So you can use hypermedia, for example, to model particular kinds of disciplinary thinking. And then finally, to provide some of the scaffolding that we've already talked about. So let me just go through some examples now. So providing context for inquiry is often video, and I'm going to show you a little bit of the stellar system and some example situations, and multi-user, now even more now, multi-user virtual environments and games. So this is the work that I did with Sharon Derry with this stellar for socio-technological environment for learning and learning activities research. And what happens here is students would get a problem and they would have to observe what went on in the classroom. They had many cases. And they would use this as the context for their problem solving. So this one is, I'm just trying to see, this is the kids building the balloon cars. So here the kids were asked, how could you tell what these kids know if you had to provide formative and summative assessments? So they had a library of video cases. The video cases were connected to problems. And the students could watch all the video clips, which were also indexed to Learning Sciences hypermedia. And I'll say a little bit more about that.